that there are some very strong connections between Calico Ghost Town and Walter Knott of Knott's Berry Farm, though it may not be the connections that you have heard or that some people think happened. You will hear the story more than once that Walter Knott bought Calico Ghost Town, tore it all down, and dragged it off to Buena Park. Not even remotely true. You'll also hear that Buena Park is a replica of Calico Ghost Town. Again, getting this backwards. The fact is, Walter Knott had all kinds of connections to Calico long before he ever came to Buena Park. When the silver mining boom hit Calico in the early 1880s, one of the big grub stakers, the people putting up the money for the miners, was the San Bernardino County Sheriff, whose name was John King. In fact, one of the biggest mines in Calico is the Silver King, named for John King. Well, John King is Walter Knott's uncle, so that's the first connection to Walter Knott and Calico. Later, after Walter Knott is married to Cordelia, living in Pomona, has a good job, but Walter Knott wanted to be a farmer. That was all he ever wanted, and he was in a hurry. And even though he was making a good job, married, starting a family, got a nice home, he wanted to get farming. Instead of saving up money to buy farmland, he decided to go out and homestead. And the place he ended up homesteading was out on the desert outside of Newberry Springs. I have been there recently to the property. Believe me, it is still the middle of BFE. And it was even more so in 1914 when Walter packed up with Cordelia and their oldest daughter, Virginia, and went out to the desert to homestead. By the way, Cordelia was not a farmer, was not a farm girl. She was a city girl. She had to learn how to milk cows and feed chickens and all the things you do on a farm. But unfortunately, out there in the Mojave Desert, trying to farm out there, they tried to grow grapes, but the well kept silting in and the weather was against them. Even Walter Knott could not farm successfully out in Newberry Springs. But typical of Walter Knott, he was going to tough it out. It took 3 years to prove up a homestead in those days, so he started looking for other work. He worked for a while on the county road crew, building what would be the earliest version of what became Route 66. And then he heard about some work at Calico. World War I was coming on, and a company had been organized to build a new mill there and go back and reprocess the tailings from the mines to gather up rare metals and things like that had value during the war years. And Walter Knott went to work as a carpenter, working on rebuilding the mill there at Calico. But he eventually left that job. He claimed, I don't know if this is true, he claimed the whole thing was just a stock scam, that they had no intention of ever working the tailings there, that they were just doing some work as an excuse to sell stock to the suckers. And when Walter found out, he left. And we do know that they never did work anything in the mill. So Walter Knott gets his homestead in 1917, and they leave the desert. Though, by the way, he owned that property for the rest of his life. And after 3 years up in San Luis Obispo County in 1920, the very end of 1920, they come to Buena Park. And this part of the story, I hope you know, they have the berry farm, which becomes the berry farm with the berry stand, which becomes the berry farm with the berry stand with the restaurant, which only later, 1934, becomes the Chicken Dinner Restaurant. 34 is the same year they introduced the boysenberry to the world. Now there's so many people coming, they start putting in attractions there, so people had something to see, and eventually Walter decides to build a ghost town as a celebration of the Old West and the American pioneers. And in 1940 starts construction on Ghost Town there at Knott's Berry Farm. And that comes along and becomes very successful. And it's only more than a decade later that the idea of going into Calico comes up. I've been trying to figure out whose idea it was. I've narrowed it down to two suspects. It's either Walter's son, Russell Knott, who, by the way, loved the desert. He suffered from asthma, so he loved to come out to the desert. He was quite the rock hound as a young man. And it's either Russell who had the idea to go into Calico, or Paul von Kleben. Von Kleben was the artist who designed most of those wonderful buildings at Ghost Town and Buena Park. And whichever one of them came up with the idea went to the other, and Paul von Kleben and Russell Knott went to Walter Knott, ganged up on him, and convinced him that this was a good idea to buy the ghost town at Calico. There wasn't much left at Calico in 1951. A couple of buildings that had survived, a couple of people living there. Some folks had a little museum. Larry Koch and his wife had a little museum there. And what Knott did was buy up some of the mining claims, which included the town site, and gave him the property there. And von Kleben went to work looking at photos and talking to old-timers, and designed a replica of Old Calico built there with touches of Knott's Berry Farm's ghost town thrown in like a bottle house. You got to have, you know, now thanks to von Kleben and Walter Knott, now every ghost town has to have a bottle house. And they built and had a second tourist attraction out here on the desert at Calico to come visit a ghost town. Well, that's how Walter Knott got into Calico. I will leave it for our tour guide there to, don't let that chocolate get away. I will leave it to the tour guide there to tell you more about the story up there at Calico. But let me tell you one last part of the story for how Walter Knott got out of Calico Ghost Town. As the ghost town became more and more popular and more tourists came out, they started driving in and parking on the desert areas around there. This is Bureau of Land Management, federal land, open land. But the feds started pushing Walter Knott that he had all these people out there, that he really needed to buy that land and create formal parking lots. Knott's response was, it's open land, they can drive and park there if they wanted. Public land for Americans. Well, you need to buy some land. Well, Walter Knott asked, all right, how much is it going to cost? And they named him some ridiculous downtown figure like $2,500 an acre or something like that. Just an insane amount of money for raw desert land, whatever the total was. And that's what got Walter Knott thinking that it was time to get out of Calico. And what he hit upon to do was to donate it to the county of San Bernardino. They made the deal in 1963 and actually waited 3 years for the county to look at the operations and decide if they really wanted to own a ghost town. And they decided they did. And in 1966, they made the formal transfer of Calico to the county of San Bernardino, who owns it to this day. And the kicker to the story is that the county of San Bernardino, because they were the county of San Bernardino, then went to the federal government and bought that same land for parking for like $5 an acre. So that is how Walter Knott comes in and out of Calico. And we will learn more about that with our tour out there. But I'm just about done with what I had to say, unless there's any last questions before I shut the microphone off for good. All right, looks like we're all free. Enjoy the rest of your drive.